All right, I propose we get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Carbon+Alt+Delete webinar, Perspectives on Corporate Climate Ambition. Very happy to see so many of you taking time to listening on this interesting topic. I will be the host today. So I'm Kenneth, co-founder CEO of Carbon+Alt+Delete. Carbon+Delete is a carbon accounting software provider. So we build software that can be used to manage and reduce the carbon footprint of companies. And we do that by working together with sustainability consultants across Europe. So we sell our software not to sustainability managers, but exclusively to sustainability consultants. This webinar will not be about our software and how we work. If you want to know more about that, I would warmly invite you to reach out to us after this webinar. Very happy to discuss. But today we zoom in on the topic of corporate climate ambition. And for that, I'm very happy to have Robert Höglund with us. He will do the heavy lifting. Robert, feel free to introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Really appreciate the invitation. So yeah, head of climate at Milky Wire. I also co-founded the market intelligence platform for carbon removal called CDR.FYI. And then I do some different work in advisory groups like the Science Based Target Initiative's Expert Working Group, which is external to them, so I'm not working for them, but and been part of several of their advisory groups previously, and write reports about both corporate climate sustainability and on carbon removal as a subtopic as well, and keep busy around these topics.
I'm very happy to have you here, Robert. You have some very interesting insights to share, so I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Before I really give the floor to Robert, a quick introduction to start with some housekeeping rules. So we're very happy to have a very big audience today, but that means that interaction needs to happen through the chat. If you have questions, remarks throughout the presentation, feel free to already put them in the Q&A chat. We'll have a Q&A session towards the end of the webinar, so I'll keep an eye on the questions. You can also upvote each other questions. I would invite you to do so. So in Teams, there is this Q&A chat button on the top of your window, so please use that. We know from experience that sometimes this is blocked or not available in your version of Teams. In that case, don't hesitate to just use the regular Q&A chat to put in your questions. And to already answer one very common question, yes, we will share the recordings and the slides after this webinar, so today or over the coming days. I would also invite you, some of you already did it, to introduce yourself quickly in the chat, just your name and organization you're working for. It's always interesting for other people in the webinar to know who else is in here. Your camera is switched off. You're always muted. Apologies for that. Don't take it personally, but it's just to manage the size of the audience that we have. As most of you know, because I assume that for a lot of you, it's not the first time you join one of our Carbon Expert Series webinars. So every year we organize 4 or 5 big webinars where we're bringing an expert speaker and we really go deep on a specific topic that is important for the carbon expert community. And this year we organize our webinars mainly around the updates that are ongoing in the greenhouse gas protocol, so the reviews of the different standards, and the science-based target update on the corporate the net zero standard. So you see the outline of the year. Today, we basically take one step back and reflect on a slightly higher level how to think about corporate climate ambition, right? It's very much linked to the work that's currently close to be final, the work that's being done by the Science Based Targets with their version 2 of their net zero standard, the corporate net zero standard. the webinar we'll have in September, there we will have someone of the Science Based Target Initiative to go really through the details of that standard. And they, of course, also talk about how to set a corporate target and how to achieve a corporate target, what is the role of market instruments in there versus direct mitigation, and so on. As we speak, also the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is working on a new standard on actions and market instruments. They recently launched a white paper, which is very interesting. I think, Robert, I saw some print screens of that white paper also in your presentation. So Robert will also touch on that. So both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the science-based targets are working on this question, how to think about corporate climate ambition, how to do it in detail, what is the role of market instruments. Robert will touch on them, but I leave it up to him to see how deep he really goes into the nitty-gritty details. He will also present a broader framework to think about corporate climate ambition. And before I really give the floor to Robert, a final question also to Paul, who's in the audience, and how you look at net zero targets. This question that you can access to the Mentimeter, so you can scan the QR code using your smartphone or go to menti.com and then use the code that you see here in the chat. I think my colleague also copy pasted the link in the chat. So the question is, your clients, the clients that you're helping with calculating their carbon emissions, setting targets, setting net zero targets, what share of your clients' net zero targets do you believe they can reach? And actually the Mentimeter is not a multiple choice, it's a slider. So if you go to the app, you will be able to put a slider somewhere between 0. So none of them will meet nothing, up to 100%, meaning all of them will meet all of their targets. Let me see if answers are coming in. Let me put this to full screen. The good thing is I see answers are coming in.
I love this when you see it real life, kind of going back and forth.
Yeah. Now, of course, we're maybe influencing people to see, because now they can see what other people have said. So we have a peak around, what is it, 25%, 50%? Some zeros, and I think the top number is around, what would it be, 90%? But let's say ballpark 1/3 of them. It's kind of the consensus of the 75, 80 people that have replied so far. And I think with this, Robert, very happy to give you the floor for the next 30 to 35 minutes, so that we have a final 15 minutes toward the end for Q&A.
Perfect. Let's see, are you seeing my presentation now?
Yes, and now in full screen. Perfect, in presenter mode. You're good to go.
Great. Introduction has already happened, so I don't need to dwell there. I work most of my time with Milky Wire, so I'll just do that first and I'll go back to the agenda, which is an impact platform that designs programs, environmental programs for companies to help reach their environmental targets or create impact in the world. So we have a climate transformation fund that is a philanthropic vehicle, companies like Spotify and Klarna donating to it, and it's going to both carbon removal, nature, and emission reductions, like to help reach global net zero. But we also have a work on fashion, regenerative agriculture, and also other topics. So it's kind of a broad impact firm doing different things in this area, including thinking about how corporate climate ambition should look. And as Kenneth already talked a bit about what we're going to talk about, both what's going on, why net zero targets are actually conditional on external change, as we could see it in the Mentimeter as well, and then talking about what would make sense and what are kind of the most impactful things that we could do and how we could guide companies given the reality we are in now. So as the number of companies with the net zero target grows, it is, I would say, actually becoming harder to reach them because reporting is broadening. You kind of needed to include more and more categories. It's more rigor that you can't exclude things, and scrutiny around the type of interventions that are allowed to be used is also increasing. So you may be surprised that as net zero targets are growing really quick still. You would think that from the public discourse maybe that companies are abandoning them, but it was a new SBTi target tracker published in here now in April, and we can see that there was a 76% increase in SBTi targets, and now it's 1,700 net zero targets. But of course, we are close to some companies' target states with 2030. So for them, it starts to become very acute. Many have 2040, 2050. It's a bit down the line, but still, people are starting to think about what will net zero target fulfillment actually mean, and can I live up to the promises that I made? And a very, very clear trend that we're seeing now with these kind of draft standards, how both on the kind of GHG protocol side, but also the other standards, is that inventory and interventions are being split. So with inventory, I'm talking about the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, the physical emissions that you report that are not influenced by any market instruments, that are based on the best available data, physical data when available, otherwise other data sets like spend data, but where you really estimate what the company has in their scopes. And this is broadening, as we said, with more scope 3 being included and this new category 16 being proposed, for example, for kind of facilitated emissions. And that is something that's going to be put very cleanly. And I think companies are going to have to report on this separately and not influenced by the kind of interventions they do. And on the other side, things like environmental attribute certificates, power purchase agreements, renewable energy certificates, carbon credits, including carbon removal, and also everything else that a company is doing that is positive for climate is being steps as kind of separated. So if we look first on the inventory side, and I know you have other webinars on this, and I'm not part of any GHG protocol working group, so this is based on also just the public things, and in other forums you may go into more detail about that. But it illustrates the trend clearly, especially the action and market instruments white paper that's open for consultation. They do have this multi-ledger reporting where you would report your physical emissions, then your market-based inventory based on things like environmental attribute certificates and power purchase agreement. They propose an impact statement where more consequential accounting could be used. So things that you do as a company that has a positive impact, but doesn't count towards your own emissions, and then possibly non-GHG indicators. And we have also the AIM platform and the TCAT, Task Force for, now I can't remember exactly what TCAT stands for anymore, but it's proposing a very similar thing, where so it's not just one actor, it's multiple actors that are looking to really separate reporting like this. GHG protocol has a lot of other things going on as well. The scope 3 revision with more broader reporting. The land sector standard is already live. I think it shows a bit of this as well in the way it's written. It's something that we'll see more about. But then crucially, as inventory and interventions are being separated, then reporting and target fulfillment becomes more clearly than before two different separate questions. So GHG protocol, they very clearly say they deal with the former, they deal with the inventory side, and target fulfillment, that's up to standard setters like the SBTi and ISO. So we're not going to get the answers of what net zero target fulfillment means necessarily from GHG protocol, at least not from what it looks like now. And then we look at the intervention side with the standard setters and so there are different opinions on how and even if these type of interventions that we talked about should count towards target fulfillment. So here I kind of this is just illustration, right? But kind of trying to illustrate 3 different camps broadly, where you have the first camp here is the permissive path. So an example could be Amazon's climate pledge, for example, where you have to have a net zero target, but exactly how you fulfill it is a bit more up to you. You can use carbon credits, you can use other things. And then net zero fulfillment would be possible for many companies. It may not still be affordable for everyone to buy carbon credits for the remaining emissions, but it'd be broadly achievable. Then on the far right, you have the contribution path, which basically says that you would have to have this multi-ledger reporting and never connected to, basically. So you have companies contributing to all these positive things, but they would never claim net zero. So in a way that's giving it up, unless you would go to absolute zero for your physical inventory, which would be almost no one, basically. At least not if you have any type of supply chain. So that's like New Climate Institute, one organization that my interpretation of their publications is this. I do interpret Gillenwater and Brokhoff's paper as well to be that some of you may have seen to be in this direction, but it could happen that they go into the negotiated path as well. So the middle one, negotiated path, it will be science-based target, also the upcoming net zero standard. It's basically that some interventions are target fulfilling, but only under strict rules. So, like, yes, you can use carbon removal, but only for the last 10% currently around. Yes, you could use an environmental attribute certificate, but only after under certain conditions that are still to be spelled out in the final standard. So that would mean that net zero fulfillment would be possible for some companies, but maybe not the majority. And yeah, it will still be quite up to external change. So we have these 2 things coming up that are the biggest, I would say, the science-based targets, net zero standard 2.0. The public consultation was in November, December, expecting Q2 this year of the new standard. And yeah, they have this kind of more stricter net zero fulfillment rules on how you can use the interventions. A really important thing, I think, in the SBTi standard 2.0 is the expanded ongoing emissions responsibility framework, which takes over from beyond value chain mitigation, BVCM, I would say. And their companies would have to report on if they finance climate projects outside their value chain and give an explanation for if they don't. So that would be mandatory for companies with an SBTi target to report on that. And then they offer also recognition then. So for companies that meet the minimum, which will be quite low level of spending on climate projects, which can be carbon credits, but can also be other things, then you could get like a recognized status. And if you're really ambitious with a high carbon fee on all your emissions, covering all your emissions, you can get a leadership recognition. So hopefully that can change some norms, but they won't count towards your target. It will be kind of contribution things. The ISO net zero standard, of course, is not public yet. We're hearing some things from it, but expected to have some public things in the middle of the year, and then it will take longer before it's operational. But it is broadly expected to be a bit less prescriptive on trajectories and the target fulfillment than the SBTi is. And taking from the latest public draft, you can see how SBTi talks about different types of interventions, where like activity level is your actual decrease, the things that decrease emissions directly. Like if you have a facility and you replace your gas boiler, you shift your cars to become EVs and so on. Counterparties, when you engage with your customers to reduce your emissions. Activity pools are where you buy energy from not a specific supplier, but you can use interventions that are influencing the activity pool. And then on the sector level can be broader market instruments like environmental attribute certificates that are not tied to an activity pool. But there's still a lot of details to be spelled out in the final standard on exactly what these things mean and how they relate to each other and when you can use what and so on. But they are broadly described on the latest draft. But a key thing here is that even if market instruments like environmental attribute certificates, power purchase agreements, and so on count, net zero fulfillment across all scopes will be unachievable for a lot of companies. How many depends on how permissive these things are. So generally, net zero targets are conditional. I mean, it's not controversial, but I think it's seldom really spelled out, actually, even if most people agree that this is, of course, is the case. Transition plans that companies publish do have dependencies listed in them, but they do not spell out normally like how large share of the target will be able to be reached through the activities that the companies do themselves and what is dependent on external change. But broadly speaking, companies have control over some emissions. It doesn't fit exactly to scope 1 and 2. They can have control over things in scope 3 as well. And some companies don't really have control over scope 1 either. I'll talk more about why in a moment. And then all of these emissions that depend on external change. And these things could fit to like the emissions within corporate control, near-term reduction targets, where the companies already have like 5-year targets and so on. These targets are often based on also what they think that they can achieve, and you have a realistic plan of being able to reach them. And to some extent, it can be based on things that you don't really influence, but you know that Google and Amazon are reducing their data center emissions. Maybe not anymore, I don't know. But that was the plan for that those would decrease, so you could count on your target going down. But then for the emissions outside your control, something that I encourage with this new lens, and it's a series of publications that lays out this. We can link to the initial ones in a follow-up email. And there's a final paper coming out which deals with kind of these conditional targets in practice. And this is supposed to be a lens on top of standards. They're not proposing to replace anything, but rather for companies to think about what it means and sort of what are the additional things that they can explain. And one of the things to explain is then what are the emissions that are outside your control? What needs to happen to have that spelled out, to have companies write in transition plans, for example. This is what we need to do. It will probably cover about this large share of our emission reductions are conditional on things that we don't control. And importantly, here are the things that we're doing to influence them. So, for example, the Oxford Spheres of Influence paper is something a lot of you probably heard about and read. I also kind of think it's a similar kind of line of argument that companies can influence things that reduces emissions, even if it doesn't count towards their own target. And for your controlled emissions, of course, it's very simple. You can reduce your emissions. You can neutralize to some extent if you're making near-term claims. But for your emissions outside your control, you're dependent on advocating for the change that you need for your target to be achievable, but also fund things that your target needs. And that could be both funding things like within your supply chain that you don't, maybe you can't count it towards your target. Maybe you can, depending on how the ESG protocol and SBTi sets out the rule, maybe some of it can be counted. But like policy and advocacy, for example, if you fund policy projects that are trying to decarbonize the grid in Bangladesh, for example, you can never count that as an emission reduction unless the grid actually becomes decarbonized, but like the intervention itself. But these things may be the most important ones. So it's important that we don't only incentivize companies to do what counts, but also what is most important for their net zero targets to actually be achieved. And those are often not the same thing. Another thing is, what kind of claims can you then make? Well, for the emissions within corporate control, of course, you can make claims that you reduced. But we also see a lot of companies making operational net zero claims where they would use carbon removal to offset the last emissions they have in scope 1 and 2, and maybe for business travel, and say that for our operational emissions, we reach net zero. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for the things that you fund for your conditional part, the things that you count towards your direct target, it's basically a contribution claim. And this is something we saw on the GHG impact statement could go in there. And it's something that won't be numerical necessarily, but it's still something that could go into the assessment if a company is doing a good work or not. So I would argue that this is what net zero really is. It's this mix of direct responsibility and then system dependence. And companies should act both on what they can do, but also try to help enable this larger change that their targets require. And I think this is it's really great that so many companies have net zero targets, because that means they're invested in trying to do this broader change. I think what's needed now is just to give the kind of framework and lens and justification for companies to also do things that go outside of the things that are only the things that are target fulfillment. The conditional, unconditional kind of maps with the Paris Agreement the countries have, unconditional NDCs, but also conditional NDCs where you can get extra finance. Same kind of mirroring this idea for companies. And what is then in the conditional bucket, and what are the different things that the companies could be doing? So I argue that it's two things that depend the constraint if a company can reduce their emissions or not. One is agency, like can you actually influence this? Is it something you yourself are emitting? Then yes. Is it something that you're buying from maybe tier 1 or tier 2 suppliers? Then maybe, yeah, you can do that. But if it's very far down in the supply chain, or if it's dependent on things that you really don't control, like the use of sold products, if you sell washing machines and you sell them to a country where the grid is not decarbonized, you're very far away from having agency for that. And the other thing is economic feasibility. Would taking the measures needed be affordable for you? And that can be high, but it can also be very low. We see that some heavy industries, for example, have very low profit per ton of CO2 they emit. And even though a cement company has full control over their kiln in scope 1, they have a very high agency over it. They may not be able to install carbon capture and storage on all their kilns unless they are in a policy environment that forces everyone to do it. So it's a level playing field, and the consumer, the next consumer can take the cost. Of course, maybe you can have demand for some cement companies to do it, but broadly, you would need to have this kind of level playing field for the economic feasibility to be high. If you're moving ahead of everyone else, then you sort of need to have high economic feasibility. And this quadrant, the possible and affordable, of course, this is where you have your near-term targets. This is where you should act as soon as possible. The one that is still affordable but outside of control, then the companies should be kind of naming what are we dependent on then, what are the blockers, and try to show what they do to make it happen, both on their lobbying, like you shouldn't be part of a trade organization that's lobbying against the thing that you need to happen for your target to change. So if your target depends on renewable energy being deployed, then you don't want your lobby organization to advocate against it, for example. Then on the economic feasibility here, possible but unaffordable, then spelling out what would it cost and what would need to change. So companies asking for broader policy change, like a emission trading system or similar. And then finally, if it's neither possible nor affordable, then yeah, you can advocate for and try to fund policy change. So that's kind of broadly 4 quadrants. Simplification, of course, but it's kind of a tool to help think around these things. And very interested in feedback on this. This matrix and quadrants are part of this next paper that's not published yet, so there's still a possibility to influence them. And generally, this quadrant would roughly be where your unconditional target is, so the part that you can achieve, where the conditional targets would live in the other 3 quadrants. And just taking a little bit of examples of what this could look like in practice. If we take the gray text here, a heavy industry company, carbon capture and storage, durable carbon removal for all their emissions, large-scale fuel switching may be unaffordable for them, even if they have high agency, they could influence it. Whereas efficiency improvements and clean energy where available could be both possible and affordable for the heavy industry company. The tech company, however, is probably mostly constrained by agency. They can afford most things, but some of the things are not really in their direct control, like use of sold products. And just taking a little bit more examples here, very illustrative only. How could it look like across sectors? Looking at starting with retail here, for example, the binding constraints will be in their scope 3, selling food store, for example. They have like tens of thousands of products, for example. There's no way that they can influence all those to reach net zero. They're very dependent on all their different suppliers to reduce emissions to reach it. Whereas the kind of financial services that have a lot of invested emissions are also broadly dependent on a global change, even if they can direct somewhat their emissions on what they invest. And the heavy industry is very dependent on policy change and having these kind of broader carbon pricing, emission trading systems, and so on. So reporting is becoming more complex, and you're adding more and more, and the rules for target fulfillment are also. But bottom line that I want to advocate for is that action matters more than accounting, and we shouldn't judge companies just for the things that they can report, but broadly more on the things that they actually achieve. This will be subjective as well. You won't be able to get a very clear answer, black on white, who's good and who's not, based on kind of target fulfillment. But there are those that try to estimate how good companies are. So Sweep and Mirova, for example, they created some climate contributions framework where they look at companies and look at what their potential for change is. So it will be different for different sectors and different companies, and then see if they live up to it. So I think that's a nice approach, where this kind of the ethos of what I'm seeing here is being put to test, where you're actually comparing companies. Still subjective, but it gives you a bit more. Is the company reducing where they have the possibility to reduce? Are they investing in things if they have the ability to invest, and giving that kind of picture of where things are going? But yes, one of the things that companies, I think, say to this is that, yeah, it's harder to motivate things that you can't directly account for. So we need to also change norms and change kind of what is expected from companies, and then make it expected that they take action that is broadly important for their targets to be reached, even if they doesn't hit their black and white statement of emission reductions. One thing I also want to touch about, because we're seeing it, and from Milky Wire side, we published a white paper on this practice, this operational net zero claims. We found 158 companies that have 2030 net zero targets, and most of them have defined their 2030 net zero targets to only cover scope 1 and 2, or scope 1 and 2 and some select scope 3 categories. There's no real standard support for this, so it's something that the companies are mostly defining themselves on exactly how an operational net zero will be reached. But it's broadly this. Some are using an internal carbon fee, but the kind of common thing is that they would use carbon removal then for the remaining emissions of scope 1 and 2 and maybe business travel, and say that we reached net zero operations, net zero ready operations, or other things. Different companies are calling it different things. We call it operational net zero here because I think that's the most common, but it is a common practice that is also, I think, the main thing that is driving currently purchases of these more expensive, durable carbon removal credits. We'll definitely see more companies start to do that. However, it would be nice to have a bit more of official guidance on this, and kind of a blessing of what is a good practice when it comes to reaching operational net zero target. For example, what are the types of credits that should be used, and what are the minimum things that should be included. But until now, companies are going by it themselves. Let's see if anything comes into the coming standards. So takeaways from this presentation, yeah, reporting and fulfillment are splitting. You should talk to and prepare companies for both. Net zero targets are conditional, so we need to encourage companies to spell out the change that they need. I think that the operational zero is a defensible thing, and it's something that gives companies a near-term win, a near-term claim. And if it's something I learned over the last few years trying to motivate companies to support climate projects, is that a lot of them are motivated by things that they can say and claim. So it is still important, but we need to encourage companies to fund a more broader system change. And finally, like what Milky Wire does on this. So I already talked a little bit about, we have this climate transformation fund, but we also set up bespoke impact programs. Could be built around a company's sector, region, or thematic profile, like fashion companies getting access to regenerative materials, or if a company is interested in R&D in their own kind of sector, or if they want to fund policy change that is relevant for their targets, we can help them put together a portfolio of projects. Could be both grants to companies or NGOs or policy work or kind of new technologies. The Climate Transformation Fund has supported 70 different projects with $17 million to help reach global net zero. And it's both new solutions for carbon removal, but also a lot of policy work. So that's for the companies, the things that are outside of your control to fund system change. Milky Way can also help companies buy carbon removal directly and get the durable credits themselves and transfer it. For example, if they have a near-term net zero target and want to reach an operational net zero. And we can also help out with thought partnership around all the things that we talked about here, giving guidance on what fits with what standards are saying, but also what makes sense and how could you communicate around this. And this is something that we can plug in, of course, as a help to you when you have clients and you want to bring someone else in. It could be behind the scenes, being able to access these different services, or also being brought in. So it's definitely something that can be additive to what many of you who are sustainability consultants, who are the main group of this audience are. All right, so that's it. Do reach out either on email or LinkedIn. I think we'll share some contact details in an email later, but this was the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Robert. You see on the clapping hands, but also on the question in the chat that's definitely thought-provoking. We already have some questions in the chat, so I'll be the facilitator of the Q&A, but I would also invite, if you still have questions, please put them in the chat. Robert, would you mind going back to one of the slides where you have the matrix structure? Because I think that's personally I like it a lot, right? To trigger companies to think about their targets as conditional or unconditional, and that does not always links one-to-one to scope 1, 2 versus scope 3, right? So 2 questions in the chat on the framework. One is most people use a version of this matrix, but then not agency, but size of emissions, right? Mm-hmm. So how would you advise consultants or sustainability managers to add the dimension of size of emissions or environmental impact to this framework?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe bubbles, like on the right? You know, the Gapminder kind of bubbles of size that could be mapping out. So you can imagine like maybe it's a huge bubble here and a smaller one here, and there could be a way of illustrating it. But just because your emissions are large, so for some companies, use of sold products is a massive, for example, category. But other than improve the efficiency of your electrical appliance, if that's what you're doing, you can't do much about it because it's dependent on policy change that the grids where people are using your product is becoming more clean. So that is huge. Doesn't mean you have much agency over it or ability to influence. But it is, of course, relevant and something where you want to show as well. So.
Yeah. In the end, it's about a 3-dimensional figure on a 2-dimensional paper, right?
Yeah.
But I think what I personally like about this, always there is this paradox between typically scope 1 emissions are for most companies lower than, for all companies lower than their scope 3, but their agency is typically higher, right? So, and in a just economic feasibility size of emissions framework, you sometimes miss on the low-hanging fruit in scope 1, right? And with here, I think it will be more apparent. A question linked to that. It's actually a very concrete example on how to apply this from Felipe on the steel sector. And I think one or two slides later you have this applied to heavy industry. But basically, Felipe is explaining that in steel operations, reducing emissions is often linked to a technological shift, replacing a blast furnace to an electric furnace, which is to some extent conditional to availability and affordability of low carbon energy, right, to provide to the electric furnace and other inputs outside of the control. I'm not 100% sure what Felipe is then referring to, but basically his question is, so there is agency in reducing own emissions, so company can decide to change technology, but it's depending on the existing technology limitations and the existing energy drivers to fuel that technology, right? So in this case, can it be argued that there is no true agency, or how to think about those, let's say, gray areas?
Yeah, of course, you wouldn't be able to like map exactly in 4 quadrants. You could also like have a grayscale up and down and so on. But yeah, then I think in that particular case, you're limited both by economic feasibility, that this is very costly. You need to have a policy environment where you have a carbon price, for example, that makes it affordable. But then also you need the grid to be able to deliver the electrons, or you need to be able to build your own energy in the near, maybe build like in Sweden, some steel power plants I think are planning to build their own wind energy and so on. So for some that may be not possible because of where they are. Maybe they can't get the grid connection. Maybe they can't build their own energy. Then yes, they're dependent on something else. So it would be kind of company specific also, not just sector specific.
Okay, interesting. Thanks a lot. There is another question related to the topic of reputational risk, right? And the question specifically is about is there reputational risk if you cannot, in cases where the contribution claims are not effective. But I would even brought it up on the question on the reputational risk. What if companies publish a target, a net zero target, and then need to, quote unquote, confess that they are not able to reach it? So on the topic of reputational risk, can you comment on that? What are your experience? What would you advise companies with those questions?
The way I see it is this framework gives the companies an ability to keep their net zero targets, but at the same time as they can explain what actually would be needed for them to happen, and have kind of a structured way of saying that this is what we're doing, this is what we're doing on the things that we don't control, and while they're keeping their net zero target. Of course, the net zero targets becomes more like a vision, because like you don't actually think you're going to reach it yourself, then it's not really a target. It's more like a vision, but then you keep them. And I think that so many companies have a net zero target as an amazing opportunity to drive more change. So we definitely don't want them to discard them. And I know some companies are thinking about maybe they should drop their net zero targets because they don't think they can fulfill them. And then this is a much better way of doing it. Of course, some companies could hide behind conditional and say that, well, it's like all conditional and we can't do much. Then I think it's more going to be down to kind of peer comparisons, watchdogs and others looking at is this, if a company publishes a transition plan that basically says we're not going to do much, it's all conditional on external change, then we would be dependent on like either people kind of publishing reports or kind of criticizing them for that, or if the SBTI or someone else would adopt some kind of version of this, then they could have more of a codified way of judging it. When it comes to contributions, if they can be a reputation risk or not, I think it really comes down also to what you're claiming. If you're claiming that we're funding this and that, and we're taking this and that efforts ourselves through lobby, etc., then you only claimed that you're taking those certain actions. You're not claiming that you're solved the problem, and it won't be any kind of greenwashing risk with that. So I think if you're just open with what you're doing and why you're doing it, the reputational risk becomes much less. think the highest reputational risk is more in not doing anything at all or completely hiding behind in conditionality.
There is another question, but I think your answer also answered that question, but I want to validate that with you, Robert. So Frederick is basically asking about, I think his company or one of his clients with very low agency over their emissions, but the suppliers of that company are requiring the company to set science-based targets, right?
Yep.
So it's the company's in a situation where they have science-based targets, they have low agency, so net zero targets are maybe infeasible or really hard or uncertain, so to say. So the question is then, what is your recommendation of how to move forward with the demand of the supplier to still have science-based targets? But my understanding is that basically the answer that you just gave, have these net zero targets, important to have it, but then be very transparent and honest and correct on what is conditional and what's not. That's also probably the answer to that situation, to that question. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. But you can also then, of course, try to trickle it down, right? Like, and have your suppliers also set net zero targets and so on. That's that theory of change with the SBTI, right? That that would happen, and it kind of goes all the way down to where the emissions are. But there's also a big risk that it stops somewhere in the way. And but yes, I would say that that's definitely a good way of doing it. You can set the target, but being transparent, and then with what you're doing. Yes.
Perfect. I also take the opportunity to squeeze in one of my own questions. Do you mind going back to the slide where you have the permissive path, the negotiated path, the contributional path, which I think I personally like a lot as a way to think about physical emissions and setting.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And interventions and the targets on both. Of course, the middle option is kind of the gray, a combination of the two extremes, and there are 100 different ways to find the gray area between the permissive path and the contribution path. But really, on your personal opinion, right? So not speaking at all on behalf of the science-based target. Where would you like us all as a sector to go? And then, if it's the negotiated path, a bit more specific on exactly then where to find the balance and what can cross the bar here on the figure.
No, I think that companies that want to reach full net zero for all their emissions and have the kind of money to do so, they should be allowed to. So as long as they use credible instruments like power purchase agreements, environmental attribute certificates like green steel or sustainable aviation fuel, and then use carbon removal, durable carbon removal for fossil emissions, then they should be able to claim net zero based on that, even though their physical emission inventory still is relatively high. I think the SBTI has been too strict on that, requiring, I would say, arbitrarily 90% emission reduction before you can use durable carbon removal. Of course, many companies wouldn't afford to spend to buy carbon removal for 50% of their emissions or so, but some companies could, and especially in the tech sector, Microsoft has been the biggest buyer, and they have a 2030 target. Now they're pausing carbon removal purchases, but they already bought 70 million tons or something that they contracted, so they may actually reach it. They won't use a standard to make that claim. Then they would just kind of make the claim themselves. But I think that companies that want to do it should be able to use the instruments. However, a lot of companies would not go that path either because they can't afford it or because they don't want to, and they shouldn't be seen as doing less good, because like a company that hasn't reached net zero, but maybe they're in a hard to abate sector, or maybe they have very low agency, but they're doing everything they can. Like they're doing the policy work, they're lobbying, they're funding interventions to unlock the things that are blocking their net zero target. They could be just as high ambition as someone who's reached net zero using market instruments. So it's one path. And I think we should allow companies, because companies want to make claims. So allow those who are rich and can do it, but don't vilify those who don't reach net zero, because it is a conditional thing for most.
Okay. And then the question linked to that also from someone in the chat is, who defines what a meaningful or impactful market instrument is, right? I think both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Target are setting some directional guidance, but at the same time, there are thousands of specific examples of market instruments where you sometimes need to have very dedicated industry knowledge and be very much into the details. So it's also not realistic that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or Science-Based Target can say a yes or a no to all of those different options. So in an ideal world, how would you organize that? Who needs to define what is a good or a bad market instrument?
I think there's a need for guidance for sure. So you can point to someone and say that, well, these people define this as a credible instrument. I think that there is a possibility for companies to use different types of standards. It could be SBTi, it could be ISO. If companies want to make their claims by themselves, they could justify why they're using this instrument and kind of who's backing it up. So I do think there is room for different ways of justifying it. I don't think it would be only one entity that puts a stamp on something, but rather like, can you argue for it? Does it seem credible? Are there credible institutions saying that this is a good measure? Which is of course frustrating because then it becomes a little bit more subjective. It's less clear. It's less black and white. But I just think that the world is not black and white, and there's just going to be that kind of need. But SBTi certainly will have a lot of opinions and info and rules and then Net Zero Standard 2.0 about that.
Very good, very clear. Thanks a lot. I'll wrap up the Q&A here. We're approaching the hour. I saw a comment, was not a question, a comment from someone like, this is a fantastic webinar, a much needed topic. So thanks a lot, Robert, for your time. Before I let everyone go, let me quickly take over the screen again, because I want to say 2 words on other webinars that are up on our site. By the way, as said before, we circulate the recordings and the slides. Still need to double check with Robert, but I guess we can also share his contact details. So if there are questions that people can still follow up with him directly. Going forward, we have another webinar planned in June on the land sector removal standard, where we will have an expert who was part of the technical working groups of the LSRS, who will explain a bit more in detail how it can be applied in practice. And after summer, we have someone of the Science-Based Target talking about hopefully then final net zero standard, right? It should be final by then. And we'll end the year on a greenhouse gas protocol update topic, most likely the corporate standard, but still a bit to be confirmed. We'll share the links to those webinars as well so that you can already register if they are of interest to you. And as we're active throughout Europe, we sometimes also do very country-specific webinars. So we have one on May 7 for the Spanish consultants in the audience here on mid-third MITECO requirements and how to think about auditing of those reports. And on May 12, we zoom in for a German-speaking audience on artificial intelligence and AI and how you can start chatting with your carbon data. So if those are relevant for you, also feel free to register for them. And with this, the only thing I still need to say is thanks a lot for joining today. Thanks a lot for the questions. Robert, big thank you to you for making the time to present the content and share your insights. Highly appreciated. And then to all of you, have a great rest of the day, and I hope to see you again in one of the next webinars. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.